Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast and my YouTube channel. Today, I have a good friend of mine with me, Georgena Eggleston. We're going to talk about the holidays and how hard they are for those who are grieving and also for those who are contemplating suicide, which means that they're going through tough times. And I know that there is so much pressure, right, Georgina, at this time of year to be perfect, to be jolly and happy, and to have all these friends around and family. And sometimes that's not what we have, and that's not what we want to have around us. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk to you on ways and give you some ideas on ways that you can go through the holidays, but also next year. What could be changed, right? So, Georgina, thank you so much for being here with us. Georgina is my good friend. I met her when I was writing my book. I was writing a new chapter on treatment of suicide grief for counselors, for clinicians. And she was one of the people that I interviewed. But then we became friends because that's what happens, right? When you have so much in common, values, mostly
Yes.
values in common. And Georgina also have a history of suicide loss. She lost her son to suicide. So first of all, Georgina, thank you so much for saying yes, for being here with us, because I know
You are
you have
so
so
welcome.
much to share.
You're so welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
Can you just tell us a little bit about your son and what happened?
Yes, actually, both my brother and my son died by suicide. My
Oh,
brother died in June of 1994, and then my son died in January of 1998. And both of these men were very sensitive, very
mm,
bright, and would give you the shirt off their back. However, they were so critical of themselves.
mm,
So my teenage son, Reed, and his girlfriend poured vodka in the orange juice that they were
mm,
drinking at our house. Then they
mm,
went to a basketball game, and at that point in time, they looked okay. By the time they got into the school, she was uproarious, and they pulled several kids out and gave them breath tests and called us and said, "We think
mm,
Reed's been drinking." We were horrified because
mhm,
you had been home. And so he failed the breath test. And I had intended, Paula, to take him to rehab the next Monday morning because
mm.
we had a history of alcohol in our
Oh, I
family,
see.
alcohol abuse.
Mm-hmm.
However, when Reed was upset, you left him alone. So his dad went to talk to the basketball coach because his punishment was being kicked off the basketball team and suspended from school for 3 days. Well,
Mm,
Reed was one of these charismatic, athletic, artistic, very popular kids who had never failed publicly.
mm,
So I said, I'm going to go see your girlfriend and comfort her. And the last time I saw my son, his head was in his hands, the shame already too much to bear.
oh,
And I left him in the room and he went out the side door and ran home. He had just as a ninth grader lettered on the cross country team.
mm,
And so we lived less than a mile from home. And so while I was comforting his girlfriend and his dad was talking to the basketball coach, Reed ran home, wrote a note on the wall, "I'm sorry, family and friends," and literally lost face. And
mm,
it will be 24 years, Paula,
mm,
on the 24th of January. So my grief is very different now than it
mhm,
was those days.
mhm.
And, for a year, I was in that raw grief where grief covers the tapestry of your life. And then
Yes.
for years, I was in fragile grief, barely holding myself together.
Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned that because it does give hope to those whose grief is so fresh right now, isn't it?
Absolutely. Mhm. And what
Yeah.
I always say is we will always be in grief, but it becomes different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
When
truly,
you,
I, Mhm.
sorry,
Oh,
Georgina. I was just thinking in retrospect because it's been a while now,
mhm.
and we know and we read about this. I mean, Georgina, for those who don't know, she also facilitates grief groups and she works with that too. But sometimes we say, well, there was no sign. It was just it was just out of the blue. I don't understand. Nothing was really happening at the time. And there was, because we know that impulse is rare in suicide. But now looking back, do you see anything differently?
What I see now is I see the fact that Reed, like myself at that time, was in grief. His grandparents, my
Mm,
parents, had died less than 6 months earlier.
mm.
Mother died of a brain tumor in July, and dad dropped dead of a heart attack in December. And then Reed died less than
Oh
6 weeks later.
my goodness, Georgina, it's a lot.
So, and then the other thing that I look back now, Paula, and I'm aware that, like, when someone else in the family has died by suicide, there's a higher propensity to that.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
the other thing that I am aware of is this, what I'm calling a profile of people that I've been checking it out as I've been facilitating groups and working with grieving parents, is the people that I know who've died of suicide, and you heard me say of suicide this time, I got it
mm-hmm.
right,
Yeah.
are sensitive, very black and white,
Mm,
very critical, often very artistic, very bright, athletic, mathematical, and like I said, so kind, but they're not
mm,
kind to themselves. They hold
mm,
themselves to such a high standard.
mm-hmm,
And so, looking back, someone said to me when we were grappling with the why, as many
mm-hmm,
people
mm-hmm.
do, this woman said Reed had never failed publicly, Georgina,
Yes. Yeah. It
and
was
he
too
literally
much.
lost face.
Yeah. Yeah. You saying this, and I remember someone I interviewed who attempted suicide. And the main thing now that she helps people who are contemplating suicide nowadays. And she said, the number one enemy that you can have is perfectionism. And
Yes,
I remember you talking about how much of a perfectionist you were too.
yes, he came
Has
by it.
that changed?
Oh, definitely, it has changed. I'm so kind now to myself, and I'm grateful that I have chosen
Mm-hmm.
to monitor myself and really let go of the pattern of perfection,
Hmm.
because it comes from fear. That's what's under it. And it comes from, I'm not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
And when I began to take very good care of myself and then be able to love myself, the
Mm-hmm.
perfection was dissipated.
Hmm. Hmm. And where did that come from, Georgina?
Oh, it,
No.
it was a family trance. That's what
Oh,
we
okay.
say in the training that I've had. My mother was a perfectionist. I was a perfectionist. My aunts were perfectionists. And
Wow.
so we all came by it naturally. And Reed definitely was.
Yeah, that's what this person I interviewed said too, is that in her family you were supposed to be perfect. Yeah, it was expected of you.
And
Well,
as I've gone
mhm,
on to say, excuse me, being
sure.
too hard on yourself can kill you.
Hmm.
And so that's what I say to anyone listening right now and watching us. If you're a perfectionist, beware.
Hmm.
Being
Yeah.
too hard on yourself can kill
Yeah, try to look at that, right? To
you.
examine that, and where does that come from, and how is that serving you,
Exactly.
right?
Because really and truly, when we look at why we want everything to be perfect, it's an aspect of control.
Mm-hmm.
And under that is we want to be safe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good
And I
point.
didn't feel safe, Paula, for decades.
Hmm.
So those are the things you and I both know, that grief brings up the deepest parts of ourselves,
Yeah.
longing to be heard and
Yeah.
thus healed.
Yes.
And so this grief journey is excruciating. And yet, when we do the work, our
Mm-hmm.
life becomes so much lighter and freer and brighter.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point too for us to start talking about how to get through the holidays, not just those who are grieving, right? But those who are struggling right now, maybe because they're perfectionists, right? Maybe because they have these very high standards that sometimes is just not okay, right? And what would you say to these people who are maybe going through crisis right now and they don't have and COVID hasn't helped because it has taken a lot of what you mentioned away from us, control, right? And the ability to even plan our lives still doesn't feel safe, still doesn't feel normal, quote unquote, right? So what are some of the things that you would say to them?
It's important for you to keep checking in with yourself. There was a question I discovered. What's the
Mm,
most kind and loving thing I can do for myself right now? And I asked that over and over and over again. And it got me from 1 hour to the next hour to the next hour. It's like a stepping stone.
mhm, mhm,
So keep checking in, listening to yourself. And my goodness, if a party comes along and you've said yes, and all of a sudden it's a no, no is your new yes. To
mm,
be able to deeply listen to yourself
mhm.
and say, no, I just can't do it this year.
So respect your limitations, right?
Yes.
And listen to what's inside of you. Sometimes we force ourselves, especially now. You're talking about party, and there is so much. Yeah, there's so much going on, and people wanted to be around, and even family. I often see my clients, and I'm sure you see the same. They're struggling because for them to be around family is painful, it's traumatic, it's part of the trauma and what's making it so hard to go through the holidays. So what I tell my clients is, you don't choose your family, you can say no. Do you agree with that?
And I do. And the word that's operable there is the word choice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We forget in grief. It feels like it's a blanket or a fog, or we're wearing this hood that, you know,
Mm-hmm.
cloak that's keeping us little and small and dark. We're more powerful than we know.
Mm-hmm.
And for us to have a word, a question that is something as a guide for us can get us through when we remember to use it. I
Mm-hmm.
just finished working with two clients,
Mm-hmm.
and I said to them, because they're struggling with anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
a form of grief,
Mm-hmm.
and I said to them, what is the benefit of having this lifelong anxiety for one client? And for the other, what is the benefit of being in this place of anxiety? Now, I wasn't being mean. Once again, we were listening, going beneath this,
Mm-hmm.
because we all have patterns that become our prisons. So when the holidays are here, as you said, our families expect things of us. And as a family that's newly bereaved because someone has died of suicide, it's really important to say, how are we going to do the holidays this year? Our
Mm-hmm.
very first Christmas, Paula,
Mm-hmm.
we left Nebraska. My
Yeah.
husband, my son, and me, and we visited friends in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And it was wonderful because we got into the sunshine. We were in a very different climate. It was the desert. And I've always looked back and said, you're the bravest people I know to host the Egglestons on their very first Christmas without Reed. But they did.
Well, you own your friends, right? That's something that you own, that
Yes.
you, yeah. You talked about something that often I often think about this is how to find the balance between, and it's a very crucial question for grief, between avoiding the memories, but also remembering who they are, right? So, and I know it takes time, and that balance is different for everyone. But I also know that in our culture, grief and after someone dies, it's all about forget them. Put the stuff away, get rid of their possessions. It's about forgetting the person because they're not around anymore, as if your relationship ended, which it doesn't. So one of the things that I often talk to clients who are bereaved and are going through this kind of loss, and it goes for any kind of loss, is that remember that your relationship is still there. And if it's not, because as you said, for you, the first Christmas you had to go away. But then after a while, if it's possible, emotionally possible for you, honor them.
And we did, Paula.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've always said Reed's name
Mm-hmm.
because when we no longer say their name,
Yeah.
that's when they're forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was very, very interesting because I continued for years to buy 2 ornaments for Vincent and Reed.
Mm.
And so it's very interesting now that Vincent is an adult and moved away. He has his ornaments, and I still have, he gave me some of his. I have his
Mm-hmm.
Vincent over there, but, and then I have Reed's.
Yeah.
And so again, the honoring is there.
Yeah. It's important, isn't
It
it?
is.
Because, but it's not the message we get from our culture,
No,
right?
no. And I always tell my clients, people will be uncomfortable
Mm-hmm.
9 times out of 10 when you say their name,
Mm-hmm.
but they also are often relieved because then they can
They
say
can
their
talk
name
about them.
and talk about
Yes,
them.
yes. I
Mhm, mhm.
was actually talking to a friend of mine who just lost his mom to, no, it wasn't suicide, it was cancer. But he was telling me, my sister is listening to her messages. Isn't that sick? And I said, no, she wants to remember her. It may be impossible for you in your level of grief, where you are in your grief right now, to listen to that, but that's perfectly healthy. Don't tell your sister that what she's doing is sick. It's what she needs to go through this moment.
And I often say to people, Paula, you're not broken by this
Mm-hmm,
grief. You're
mm-hmm,
broken open to grow in consciousness. And I had a client last night that said to me, working with you has taught us a different way to be in the world.
mm-hmm,
And there are animal signs that they feel very comforted by as they're in communication because their child loved animals.
mm. Okay, so it's kind of their way
It
of
is.
keeping the memory around and
Mhm.
what reminds them of the kid.
And just last week, I read the neatest thing. Grief, the way each of us move through grief is as individual as our fingerprint. Isn't
Mm-hmm.
that perfect?
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah.
Mhm.
And the other thing that we forget too when we're suffering is that it's an expression of your love. The opposite of grief is having no love, right? You only suffer if you have relationships and people that you love. So it's an expression of, so honor your grief as well because it means something.
And the other thing I would say to clients, I said this to a client yesterday in the office. What makes grief hard for many of my clients, and what made grief hard for me was
Mm-hmm.
my own thinking.
Hmm. In what way? What do you mean by that?
I just kept replaying the story. I kept feeling guilty. I
Hmm.
kept longing. I made the comment to my client last night that all of the signs and all of the comfort
Mm-hmm.
wasn't enough. And I look back now and I just am amazed of all the miraculous things that happened. And it wasn't enough because I was in such deep longing and
Mm-hmm.
sadness.
Yeah, yeah. It does make it, it does cloud your
It
judgment,
does.
your
It does.
thoughts. Yeah.
And I wished I would have had someone like me that could have said,
Mm-hmm.
okay, yes, you can be in this place of grief. And now let's balance it out. And let's
Mm-hmm.
come up by choice
Mm-hmm.
and look for the glimmers of good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The smell of the pine, the
Mm-hmm.
lights on the tree across the street outside,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
It's
And
around us.
prioritize yourself, right? This is a time to really take good care of yourself and look at things like what has helped you, right? When you are in those days that you don't want to get out of bed, what helps? So do more of that, right? The other side of that is what's stopping you from moving forward or from moving into the direction you want to move. What's stopping you? And when you realize these two things, do more of what helps and try to eliminate what keeps you stuck, right?
Very definitely. And again, what we've just talked about in this time together is what I termed mindful grieving, to have the awareness
Mm-hmm.
of what's keeping me stuck, to have the awareness that what is helping, and then
Mm-hmm.
to go to
Mm-hmm.
that place of choosing more of the, not the positive, but the support,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
grief is grueling. You and I both know that.
Yeah, yeah. And you talked about support. Let's talk about connections because we know that nothing, you can read 200 books, watch videos, right? Drink, do whatever you want, but nothing is as healing as a good friend, as a good family member, as a good connection. So, one of the things that I find can really, really help, and it's hard during grief because, again, people are so uncomfortable around it, but just push it and try to reconnect. Of course, be selective, right? Be selective, be very careful who you surround yourselves with, but try and make an effort to be around people who care about you, even if they don't say the best things, right? Because they won't. They'll say the weirdest things that would not land well with you, but you know who are the people who care or who want, even if they say the wrong thing, but you can help even educate them on your grief, right? But make an effort to connect.
And it's very interesting, Paula, because how many times have we as grievers and those listening heard, let me know what I can do to help.
Mm.
Unfortunately, it's those of us who are in the grief who also have to be the educators.
Mhm.
So for us to be able to say, please text me a heart once a week so that I know you're thinking of me.
Mm.
Please text me thinking of you, or I'm just checking in.
Mhm.
How's your grief? Never, how are you? How's your grief?
Mhm.
And then the other thing for our listeners to be able to say is, come and simply be with me. Let's go for a walk and be in silence. Let's
Mhm.
go to a movie and be in silence.
Mhm.
Be with me. Don't fix me.
No, there's nothing
Just
to be
be with
fixed.
me. That's right. No, there's nothing to fix. I'm grieving.
Yeah, the other day I offered my listeners to host a group, and one of them asked me, Paulo, is that okay if I don't talk, if I just listen? Because that's what I need right now. And I said, whatever you need. We're not here to tell you what to do. If that's what's healing for you, just sit there and listen. So it's different for everyone. And as you said, you can just have someone. I actually, I don't know if I read it. It was a book, and he was talking about this friend after he lost his wife. He had this friend who would come every single day, knock on his door in the morning. He would get out. They would go for a walk, silent. He would come back home, go back, not say a word for days. And he said that was the most healing thing I had. Isn't that beautiful?
It is beautiful. I had a friend who
Mm.
came every Sunday afternoon, and we went up to my bedroom and sat on the floor by my bed.
Mhm.
And she would tell me stories about Reed because
Mhm.
she worked in the schools as a
Mhm.
speech language
Mhm.
pathologist.
Yeah.
And it was so wonderful to learn things about my son, how, how he had made such a difference in people's lives. And
Mm-hmm.
again, that was that glimmer of good. And she didn't
Yeah.
stay long, 20 minutes. She knew that I was fragile, and
Wow, what a
it was
friend.
amazing friend,
Yeah,
amazing
yeah,
friend.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So yeah, those are the ones you want around during this time in holidays and everything. The other thing too, and you mentioned that it happened to you because you were stuck for so long, those little last moments with your son, and the guilt and the self-blame that you went through, which we know it's very common after suicide. But remember, and that's talking to you who lost your loved one, remember that your relationship was way more than those last minutes or that last day or the last few months, maybe that they were showing the signs and you maybe didn't notice or didn't think it was so important. Just remember that it's more than that. You have years and years and years of a relationship that you need to remember. Try not to get stuck on those last moments because there's way more than that. You were good, you were present, you were there with this person. You weren't perfect because we're never perfect, but it's more. Don't get stuck there.
We always say in the suicide bereavement support group, Paula, don't dwell on how they died.
Mm,
Remember how they
they
lived.
lived. Yeah.
And so don't remember how they died, remember how they lived.
Mhm. Same thing with this year. It was a hard year for you. Maybe
Yes.
the last few years were hard, but also try to think of all the things you accomplished, even though you were grieving, right? Even though you were grieving, it's not just the pain and the moments when you feel that you're stuck, that you're immobilized, but all the things that you actually got done.
Yes. And again, it's those little things that add up. Consider your life like a string of pearls. And
Mm-hmm.
each of those little things that you do is a pearl on that pearl necklace.
Mm-hmm.
And just
Yeah.
imagine if you made a strand of pearls for every month, that beautiful necklace that you'd have by the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Anything else, Georgina, you want to tell them? Maybe for next year, one
Yes.
thing that comes to mind for me is set up expectations that lower your expectations a little bit for last year. Don't expect so much to get so much done.
Mhm.
So I think that's one of the things that realistic expectations. Otherwise, you'll be setting yourself up for failure.
Mhm. And that goes back to that perfection,
Mm-hmm.
expecting too much.
Yeah.
So for me, it's set your intentions
Mm-hmm.
and consider what would life be like if you caught that jet stream of ease and flow. Just as you watch a sunset or you watch a sunrise, the sun comes up every morning. Remember that.
Mm-hmm. One step at a time, right? One day
Exactly.
at a time.
Mhm. And look for the glimmer of good. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things you can do is you can ask a question out loud. And the question is, how is good going to show up in my life today? If
Mm-hmm.
that's too much for our listeners, let's put it down a notch. How is support going to show up in my life today?
Mm-hmm.
And if that's too much, how can I listen to myself
Mm-hmm. And be open to see
today?
the
And be
light.
open. Mhm, mhm. Be willing, be open to see the wonder.
Mm-hmm.
That's wow.
Yeah, that's
WOW.
transform.
Really,
Yeah, it transforms you.
it does.
Georgina, thank you so much for doing this. I wanted someone special to be with me at this last podcast of the year. I want to thank my listeners for being with me, for keeping me company. Yes, for making this work meaningful because that's what makes it meaningful, having you listening. and valuing, and the messages you send me, the questions that you ask me, the participation, all of that makes this so precious to me. So thank you so much for one more year together, and I'll see you next year.